This lecture deals with family violence, including intimate partner violence, in this part of the lecture, and in the second part of the lecture, which has been split into a second presentation due to length, child and elder abuse. Intimate partner violence, or IPV, sometimes also called domestic violence, relationship violence, or spousal abuse, is defined as the physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, or sometimes threatened or proxy abuse or violence, inflicted by one's spouse or current or former intimate partner. Proxy violence or abuse occurs when the abuser hurts or threatens to hurt others, such as the victim's children, pets, or other family members, as a way of controlling the victim. IPV is constituted by a wide range of behaviors. These include physical abuse or threatened abuse, such as hitting, slapping, kicking, choking, punching, or pushing. Verbal abuse, including constant criticism, humiliation in front of others, yelling or screaming. Sexual violence, or forcing sex on an unwilling partner or demanding sexual acts that the victim does not want to perform. Isolation, making it difficult for the victim to see friends and relatives, monitoring the victim's phone calls, reading their email, or controlling where they go. Coercion, manipulating or blackmailing the victim into obeying the abuser. Harassment or stalking. Proxy violence or control, such as harming children or pets, or threatening to or filing false accusations with law enforcement. For example, if you call the police, I'll say you're the abuser and they'll arrest you. Or, if you try to leave me, I'll tell CPS you're a bad parent and they'll take your children. Destruction of the victim's property can be used. Abusers may also use threats of self-harm as a means of exerting control, saying, if you leave me, I'll kill myself. Finally, abusers may engage in what's called reproductive coercion or birth control sabotage as a means of keeping or controlling their victims by forcing them into an unwanted or unexpected pregnancy. We'll talk about that in a second. Some intimate partner violence may take the form of sexual violence. The Center for Disease Control defines rape as the attempted or completed forced penetration, either with a penis, some other body part, or some other object, of the vagina, anus, or mouth, or penetration while the victim is unable to consent due to drugs, alcohol, or unconsciousness. Lifetime reported rape victimization is about 18.2% of women in the United States and about 1.4% of men. In more than half of all cases of rape, the perpetrator is someone who is well known to the victim, often a current or former intimate partner or domestic partner. Only 13.8% of women and 15% of men report being raped by strangers. For both female and male victims, the perpetrators are usually men. 98% of female rape victims report one or more male perpetrators, and 93% of male victims report the perpetrator was one or more men. About half of female rape victims report that the rape occurred before they were 18 years of age, and nearly 80% report that it happened before age 24. With men, almost 30% were age 10 or younger. Intimate partner violence is a significant social problem and an unfortunately common one. 24% of women and 12% of men will report being a victim of IPV at some point in their lives. Female victims of IPV will often be subjected to more serious or injurious violence than male victims of IPV, although not always. But IPV abuse is still a significant men's health problem, specifically because there are so few community resources, such as shelters, that will admit or are specifically tailored to help male victims. About 1,200 women are killed every year and 2 million injured through IPV, according to a CDC study in 2007. Intimate partner homicides account for about 30% of all homicides of female victims and about 3% of male victims' homicides. They may also result more often in the murder or injury to third-party victims, such as children or the police. The risk of injury or death in an abusive relationship increases after divorce or separation, so when the victim tries to leave, and also during pregnancy for female victims. In fact, according to a study conducted and published in 2011, the number one cause of death in the United States among pregnant women is murder. 20% of pregnant women who die are victims of murder, usually at the hands of an intimate partner, often the father of the pregnancy, compared to 6% of non-pregnant women. This picture depicts a very famous victim of intimate partner homicide, Lacey Peterson, who was killed during her 7.5 month of pregnancy on Christmas Eve by her husband Scott Peterson, who then dumped her body in the San Francisco Bay and told police she'd been abducted by strangers while walking the dog. Scott Peterson was eventually convicted for the murder of her and his near full-term unborn son, Connor, and is now on death row. Both men and women are equally likely to admit to using some physical force in disputes with partners. About 12% of women and 12% of men will admit to having done this at some point in their life. However, violence perpetrated by male abusers does tend to be more frequent, consistent, and severe. About 90% of systematic, persistent, and injurious violence is perpetrated by men, according to both sociological and law enforcement data. It may also be, however, that systematic, persistent, serious, and injurious violence committed against men is simply less likely to come to the attention of law enforcement, or is less likely to be reported by victims due to cultural stigmas against men being victimized. Across abuse types, according to law enforcement data, women are still more likely to report having experienced certain kinds of abusive or coercive behaviors on behalf or at the hands of their partners than are men. Women here represented in blue, men in red. However, in many categories, the differences are not that large. For example, 30% of women reported having, at least at some point in their lives, been slapped or shoved by a partner, compared to about 25% of men. Women were more likely, almost twice as likely as men, to report having suffered severe violence, so violence, for example, that necessitated medical attention. Women are also more likely, about twice as likely, to report having been threatened by a weapon, such as a knife or a gun. Verbal abuse, more common among women than men, but not severely so. About 62% of women reporting, versus a little over 50% of men. Women more likely to report having been isolated or having a partner attempted to isolate them. More likely to report their partner threatening to harm them, again, by about twice as likely. Slightly more likely to report having a partner threaten to harm themselves or actually harm themselves, for example, threatening to kill themselves if their partner leaves. More likely to report that their partner has threatened to take their children or deprive them of custody, and more likely to report that their partner has threatened or has destroyed property. There is, however, one form of intimate partner violence that men are more likely to report being victims of than women, and that is reproductive coercion. Reproductive coercion occurs when a partner tries to force pregnancy or parenthood on an unwilling intimate partner, for example, by sabotaging contraception, including hiding, withholding, destroying, or removing either female-controlled contraceptives, for example, or deliberately breaking or removing a condom during sex, or failing to withdraw in an attempt to promote pregnancy despite a partner's wishes to prevent pregnancy. Reproductive coercion is more common in violent relationships, as forcing a pregnancy or parenthood on someone is a very good means of keeping and controlling them. Among women who reported experiencing reproductive coercion, 32% experienced intimate partner violence in the same relationship. Nearly half of the women who experienced or reported birth control sabotage also reported intimate partner violence, as did more than 1/3 of women who experienced pregnancy coercion. So, a partner, for example, pressuring them to become pregnant. Reproductive coercion is, however, as said, more likely to be experienced by men than women. It was reported by about 4.8% of women in one study and 8.7% of men. Between 9 to 10% of both women and men reported an experience of at least one partner who had refused to use condoms or contraceptives. Rates of IPV among straight and same-sex couples appear to be similar. However, due to societal homophobia, or fear or hatred of gays and lesbians, Gay men and lesbian victims of IPV may experience it in a very different way than do heterosexual victims of IPV. Gay men are more likely to be physically battered by their partner than straight men, probably because the strength differential is decreased or removed in a relationship with two men versus one between a man and a woman, but have fewer available community resources, such as shelters. Male victims of domestic violence, either gay or straight, often face a community with no resources dedicated to support them, and in many cases, no domestic violence shelters that will admit men. Only a handful of domestic violence shelters exist nationwide that will admit male victims. Gay and lesbian victims of IPV also appear less likely to seek help from the police, probably because of fear that they either won't be believed or that they would face embarrassment, ridicule, or even harassment from unsympathetic police officers or courts. Females between the ages of 20 and 24 tend to be statistically at the highest risk for experiencing intimate partner violence. If young women are most in danger, that likely indicates that young men are most at risk for becoming batterers. Rates of intimate partner violence are negatively correlated with income, meaning the risk goes down as household income goes up. It tends to be more common among the lowest earning or most impoverished households. Annual rates of IPV in the lowest income groups, for example, are about twice that in the second lowest group, which are in turn slightly higher than those in the third lowest income group. And one of the best predictors of the onset of domestic violence is unemployment or job loss. If poverty and unemployment are risk factors for the onset of domestic violence, that might lend some credence to the frustration-aggression perspective, which is a theory that attempts to explain why domestic violence or intimate partner violence may happen in some households, for example, but not others. The frustration-aggression perspective argues that violence is created because it is an outburst of displaced anger against a safer target. For example, if a man is disrespected at work, but he cannot respond to this for fear of losing his job, he may go home and take his anger and frustration out on his wife or his children instead. The frustration-aggression perspective theory is also used to explain riots and revolutions. However, this model has also been criticized for allowing the perpetrator to diffuse blame. If the battering is a result of stress, for example, does that mean that the batterer has less or no control over his or her actions? This, too, is unlikely. Most of the data on domestic violence that we see indicates that perpetrators do act out violence in ways that are very strategic, often planned, and certainly not out of their control. We'll talk about this in a second. One other theoretical model that attempts to explain differences in observed family violence patterns between households and between cultures is what's called the political or power relations model. In this model, IPV or abuse tends to be more common in non-egalitarian cultures or families. For example, in cultures or families where men are expected to exert dominance and control over other people, where machismo or male power and control is glorified, and where women, also children and weak men, are given less cultural value and expected to submit to authority. There is some support for the idea that cultural attitudes about the acceptability of male domination in the household and the acceptability of male violence toward women, toward other men, or toward children correlate with higher incidence of IPV. A cross-country study conducted by the World Health Organization found that in the least gender egalitarian countries, lifetime reported experience of IPV was far more common than it was in the most gender egalitarian countries in the world, countries like Norway, where men and women are the most economically, socially, and politically equal. For example, about 47% of Bangladeshi women surveyed indicated that they had at some point in their lives been exposed to violence at the hands of an intimate or domestic partner or spouse, whereas in Norway, the percentage was about 18%, lower even than in the United States. However, Even within more developed nations, there may be many men who take this kind of ideology of male domination to heart and are more likely to try to dominate their wives or children as a result. James Potacek interviewed 18 batterers and found that many used justifications suggesting both that male violence was natural and that it was also necessary for a man to maintain dominance over his wife and to occasionally use physical coercion or force or threats of force to do so. Moreover, contrary to the frustration aggression model, which assumes loss of control, evidence tells us that most abusers choose their victims selectively and strategically. Only 28% of the batterers in Potacek's study, for example, committed violence against non-family targets. If violence were an outgrowth of uncontrollable stress and frustration, we would expect to see batterers lashing out more randomly, rather than strategically and calculatingly choosing only victims that are least likely to be able to fight back or least likely to be able to bring about social consequences for this behavior. The political power relations model also has its limits, however. For example, it does little to explain IPV perpetrated by women against men or by women against other women. A third model, which attempts to explain IPV or identify risk factors for either becoming a victim or a perpetrator of it, is the social learning perspective. This perspective simply states that children from violent homes or households, social context, or cultures where violence occurs may tend to learn that violence is an acceptable or effective way of controlling others, or that some element of domination, control, and or abuse is inevitable in relationships. The data do tell us that children who grow up in violent homes are about twice as likely to either perpetrate or suffer from IPV as adults, indicating that some element of social learning probably is in operation in these people's lives. One piece of good news in this chart provided by the Bureau of Justice Statistics is that rates of domestic violence, both against men and against women, do seem to be dropping. From a high in 1993 and 1994, we see a steady decline over time, this chart ending after 2012. We also see an uptick in rates of reported violence against women around the 2008-2009 financial crash. So, a relatively strong or recovering economy could account for some of this decline, at least since 2008 and 2009. We might also see that women have increasingly more economic choices, can better support themselves and their children when they leave marriages or relationships. It may also be that over time we're seeing the effect of more education, more community outreach, and more legal services protections for victims of domestic violence. Also, during the same period of time, we've seen a relative decline in crime across all crime types, which it would be the subject of a different lecture. Domestic violence-related police calls have been found to constitute the single largest category of calls received by police, accounting for between 15 to more than 50% of all calls across jurisdictions. Between 25 to 35% of those will be considered chargeable, meaning there's sufficient indication of criminal activity to file a charge or make an arrest. Only a fraction of IPV cases that are reported will result in any kind of prosecution. One reason for this is that many victims will refuse to cooperate or will recant. This is not uncommon. National Institute of Justice data indicate that maybe 30% of all victims will refuse to cooperate with police during initial police contact. They'll reach out to the police simply in the hope of making the abuse stop, not necessarily with the intention of going through with filing charges. Many more will drop out, recant, or try to drop charges later on. Maybe as many as 50% will refuse to cooperate in a criminal investigation. Reasons given to the 2005 National Crime Victimization Survey for not reporting abuse incidents included a belief that the abuse was a private or personal matter. About 22% of women who indicated having experienced abuse gave this as a reason for not cooperating with law enforcement, compared to 39% of men who had experienced abuse. A fear of reprisal from the batterer, 12% of females and 5% of males reported this as their reason for not wanting to cooperate with prosecution. A desire to protect the suspect or the abuser, the case for 14% of females and 16% of males, and a belief that the police won't do anything, reported by 8% of women and about also 8% of men. Spousal abuse or intimate partner violence tends to be cyclical rather than constant. After an act of violence, there's usually a honeymoon period wherein the abuser apologizes, swears to change, cries, begs, makes promises, and is attentive and sweet, a real prince or princess charming. After the honeymoon period, the normal routine returns. The victim will often report then experiencing a slow buildup of tension and controlling or threatening behavior, till the victim has the sense that he or she is walking on eggshells, just waiting for the axe to fall. Then, finally, the act of violence reoccurs, and the cycle starts again. With time, as the abuser learns that his or her behavior is unlikely to result in serious consequences, the honeymoon periods may get shorter and the violence more frequent or severe. Unfortunately, batterers have a fairly high recidivism rate. Recidivism refers to the likelihood of somebody who has been prosecuted for a crime in the past repeating that or another crime in the future. Batterers who have a previous arrest for assault are likely to reoffend. The 5-year rearrest or recidivism rate is about 60%, according to a study by the National Institute of Justice in 2009. Things that increase the risk of reoffending include the severity of the abuse. The more severe the abuse, the more likely the batterer is to reoffend. If the batterer has a past or lengthy criminal record for any kind of crime, people who get arrested a lot aren't likely to be scared straight by another arrest, for example. A history of substance abuse or a history of unemployment. The role of unemployment is interesting here, and there are probably a couple of reasons that make a difference. One, it may include frustration, and for men, a feeling of powerlessness or emasculation, which may be compensated for by dominating one's partner or children, for example, as a way of trying to make one feel strong or powerful again. It may also be the case that a man who is unemployed simply perceives that he has less to lose from an arrest or an incarceration, so there's no fear of losing a job, for example, if the police are called and the batterer is taken into custody. Because batterers do have such a high recidivism rate, and because so many victims will recant or refuse to cooperate with prosecution, many municipalities, including Harris County, have adopted a model for the prosecution of domestic violence called no-drop prosecution. This is a model wherein the prosecution goes forward even without the victim's cooperation. So even if the victim opts to drop charges, for example, or refuses to act as a friendly witness, the court will continue with the prosecution of the batterer regardless. The victim may even be treated as a hostile witness at trial, compelled to testify, for example, and cross-examined by the prosecutor as a way of trying to undermine the validity of his or her recantation. No-drop prosecution can be very hard. Since most incidents of IPV happen in the victim's home and are not witnessed by third parties, it can be very hard to pursue a case when the only eyewitnesses, both the victim and the accused, refuse to cooperate or lie and say it was an accident. However, evidence does show that being prosecuted and sentenced can reduce the likelihood of reoffending, and the more intrusive the sentencing, for example, jail or prison time, the more strong the effect we see. So intrusive sentences tend to work better than fines or suspended sentences, for example. Other interventions like anger management classes or court-mandated abuser education interventions have more mixed effects. This concludes part 1 of our lecture on family violence, which is focused on intimate partner violence. In the second part of this lecture, we'll look more at violence affecting other members of households, such as children or the elderly. Thank you for listening.